Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Shakespeare Hour Live. My name is Simon Godwin, and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company. Welcome. Thank you for spending St. Patrick's Day with us for our, can you believe it, our 40th episode tonight. I mean, wow. Shakespeare Hour Live is a component of Shakespeare Everywhere, which is, of course, made possible by the visionary Beach Street Foundation. So my thanks to them and to Nan Beckley for additional support. And tonight's episode is sponsored by Catherine B. Elwell. Thank you so much, Catherine. Also tonight, I want to, if I may, give a shout out, a special birthday shout out to STC's own Laura Williamson, our Director of Development, a big fan of the show. And so we say happy birthday, Laura, from all of us that work on the program. Well, we're going to be talking tonight, of course, about Arthur Miller's The Crucible. So not a Shakespeare play, but we're talking about this remarkable play, partly because we're hoping in our reopening season to be producing it in a production that's going to be directed by Whitney White, who we'll be meeting later. And in a way, it feels exciting to think about Shakespeare's legacy in relation to Miller. How much can we speak of The Crucible as a Shakespearean play? How much do we learn about Miller and indeed learn about Shakespeare by looking at Miller's remarkable classic text? So that's going to be kind of one of the big themes of this evening. And in order to share this wonderful discussion, we, of course, have got a wonderful panel of guests. Let me start by introducing, if I may, Professor Susan Abbotson, Professor of Modern and Contemporary Drama at Rhode Island College and the performance editor of, usefully for tonight, the Arthur Miller Journal. Professor Abbotson, may I call you Sue?
Absolutely.
Terrific. Well, let me ask you, if I may, Sue, first about a non-Miller related question, which is you have some striking instruments on the wall behind you. So where are you broadcasting from, and will you be using the instruments tonight?
I am in Cranston, Rhode Island, in what was the shell of what used to be the Ukulele Hall of Fame Museum. My husband and I got very much into the ukulele back in the 1990s and started collecting them. We have around 250 in the house.
Wow.
But then we started having children, and so the ukuleles took second. They sort of got pushed to the back a little bit. So we still have them, we play them, and we love them. And I love to think that maybe Arthur Miller would have played one. He's just the right generation. I wouldn't be at all surprised. But I am not going to play one today. I'm a little rusty, and these ones don't have strings.
I see. I was thinking of the Chekhov piece of advice that if you have a gun in the first act, it's got to go off by the third or the fifth. But so it's not going to be the case with your ukuleles. But I've got a wonderful image of you and your children all sitting around playing them on a winter's evening. Absolutely.
All three of my children actually can play the ukulele and do.
Wow, this is terrific. Well, so congratulations on that. I mean, apart from everything else that you've achieved. Well, whilst we grapple with Professor Abbotson's ukulele experience as well as with Arthur Miller, let me introduce, if I may, Jason Batlahana, whose Broadway credits include The Coast of Utopia and indeed The Crucible, directed by Ivo van Hove, a remarkable, indeed legendary production that I was very fortunate to have seen. Jason can also be seen on the hit Netflix series OZARK. So, hello, Jason, how are you?
Hi there. I just want to talk about Sue and the ukuleles right now, but I'm willing to talk about Miller for a little bit.
Well, let's try to fit some Miller in between the ukulele chat. And where are you, Jason, this evening?
I am in my guest room in Los Angeles. I'm workshopping a new play by Stephanie Kuo this week about Dr. Wu, who worked on the Manhattan Project with Oppenheimer. So this is my setup. Everything is hidden behind this there's a gray drop behind me.
Right, so you might at some point, release the drop during the evening, and we might.
Yeah, there's no ukuleles, but that would be amazing.
That would be amazing. And the play that you're rehearsing, is that going to be something that's going to be on Zoom, or is going to be in the theatre even?
As a matter of fact, this Friday, they're going to present a few scenes from the play through, it's a co-production with the Kitchen Theater of Ithaca, which is interesting because I was born in Elmira, New York, and the Mailly Theater Company of New York City. So it's been great. We're going to talk about text, but I have to say, an actor not getting to act a whole lot in the last year, it's been a really great week and a half to develop a new play with fantastic language and complex thought and structure that is really dynamic and incredible. So I'm glad to have had that for a week and a half and launch me into this talk with everybody.
Well, I was going to say, you're going to be match fit to put stuff in Shakespeare this evening. So that's terrific. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Obie Award winner and STC Associate Director, Whitney White, the director behind STC's The Amen Corner, and indeed our upcoming production of The Crucible. Whitney, it's great to see you again.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I suspect you're in New York this evening, am I right?
I'm in New York, holding strong in Brooklyn. Life is kind of starting to return to us. People are poking their heads out of their homes. It's a very positive kind of thing. It's good.
That's great. And I've heard, Whitney, that Shakespeare in the Park is coming back this summer.
Yes, that is the word on the street. We are all fingers crossed. We also have this wonderful initiative across the city that I'm a part of. I'm on a council for, called New York Pops Up, through Governor Cuomo's office. And we're programming pop-up performances all over the city. Patti Smith did one recently, basically from February and through August. So things are happening, and there's all these wonderful initiatives to revive the arts that will be, I'm sure, spreading nationwide, which is really great.
That's wonderful, Whitney. I'm sure that's spoken to your lack, and in terms of it, we've all lacked what Jason was saying about the lacking of the chance to be directing plays, but it sounds like that's really feeding something that you've, I'm sure, be feeling the absence of.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, okay, terrific. Also tonight with us is Grace Ann, our wonderful line producer. Hello, Grace Ann. How are you?
Hey everyone, good evening. I'm great. I'm so excited to celebrate our 40th episode this way. So
brilliant. And you're, of course, our fantastic conduit to our viewers, who are, I'm sure, in good form this evening. Any early thoughts or comments from the viewers tonight?
yes, many have joined in with us in celebrating Laura Williamson's birthday. So happy birthday again, Laura. Lots of love for her in the chat tonight. So.
Oh. Well deserved, thank you. And last but not least, my colleague and co-host, Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, STC's resident dramaturg. Drew, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. So yeah, Simon, as you were saying, we were discussing Arthur Miller's The Crucible. It's the first time in our 40 episodes that we're not discussing Shakespeare or Shakespeare play, but we are not really leaving the 17th century, if you think about it. It's on the other side of the 17th century from Shakespeare, but The Crucible is based upon actual historic witch trials that did happen in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. The play premiered in 1953, so it's often read as an allegory by Miller of what was happening in American politics post-World War II, the McCarthyism. The play actually premiered before he testified before the House on Un-American Activities. But what's really fascinating about The Crucible, as we'll discuss tonight, is that in the 21st century, it's actually been revived quite famously and independently of its immediate McCarthyite context. There was Evo's production on Broadway. Yael Farber, who will be familiar to STC subscribers, revived it to great acclaim in London at the Old Vic. So this is a play that is very much still with us, as much as any of Arthur Miller's plays are. Obviously, there was the film in 1996 directed by Nicholas Teitner, starring Daniel Day-Lewis and Winona Ryder, which I screened this afternoon in preparation for tonight's chat. But what we thought we would focus on for tonight's episode, since we have such a wonderful audience of Shakespeare-loving nerds out there, is the ways in which this play is and is not Shakespearean. Obviously, there's the genre, that this is a kind of answer by Miller to the Shakespearean history play. There's the fascination with witches and witchcraft, which is a motif or a metaphor that pops up here and in Shakespeare. There's the language of the play. There's a number of ways in which this play seems Shakespearean. So we thought we would start with that kind of provocation. Usually I synopsize the play, but spoiler, it's the Salem witch trials. You can Google it. Sue, I wonder if you could maybe orient us a little bit in this question and also give us a kind of introduction to the world of Miller and The Crucible that you know so intimately well.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. Miller always insisted that while McCarthyism may have been the historical occasion of writing the play, it's not really its theme. And it actually strikes me that in some ways, Miller's actual process in writing this play was very Shakespearean, because he actually went, like Shakespeare went to the historical chronicles, the Hollinshed Chronicles, and got his stories. This is what he did. He went to Salem and he studied. He read all the trial transcripts and letters and books and reports that he could find to really sort of delve into what actually took place. I mean, he has a note at the start of the play, of the script at least, where he comments on the fact that the play is predominantly accurate as regard to facts, which it actually is. I mean, Miller, as I say, he really read through the transcripts. I mean, things like Tituba's confession, Saragud's condemnation at not being able to recite the 10 Commandments, Rebecca Nurse, her steadfastly claimed ignorance, even Giles Corey and his whole complaints about his wife preventing him, his wife's reading preventing him from saying his prayers. Even Mary Warren actually did give Elizabeth a poppet. These are all actual historical facts. But he does, I think it's interesting, add to that comment that he made some changes for dramatic purposes. And of course, I mean, some of them were fairly obvious. He just, he didn't want to crowd the stage too much, so he reduced the number of girls that were crying out. He also reduced the number of the judges too. He sort of just had sort of representations of those. But he also made John Proctor a real central character. In the trials, he was there, but he was not a central character. And he definitely makes Proctor, I think, a far more liberal thinker than the real John Proctor would have been. He's sort of questioning of various tenets of the church. That definitely would not have been a case with the real John Proctor. He also gives him this past guilty sin that he has to deal with, and also has him do this whole confession and then later recantation. All of that is made up. That's Miller adding in, just like Shakespeare used to add in his, details to the history to make it more interesting. He increases, and this is the big one, he increases Abigail's age. In the original story, she's like 11 years old, and he increases her age to be able to create this love triangle between his wife and Abigail and Proctor. And it's because it's very notable, this is exactly what was happening in Miller's own life at the same time. He had, in 1951, gone out to Hollywood, met Marilyn Monroe, fallen head over heels, panicked, run back to his wife, apologizing, "Oh, Mary, Mary, I didn't mean it," going into marriage counseling. He actually dedicated this play to Mary, his wife at the time. And of course, in the play, he has his stand-in Proctor push the Abigail Marilyn away and say, "No, I'm staying with my wife." Obviously, I just thought it was kind of interesting. He actually managed to make his marriage last, Miller that is, for 3 more years before he actually did divorce and run off to Marilyn in the end. But also the judges are interesting too. I mean, Miller, he made the Governor Danforth character, who seems awful in the play, and possibly the most evil character. But he actually said he made him a lot more accommodating than the original. The original Danforth would never have listened to any counter arguments and allowed, all of that testing. He would have just put his foot down and moved along. And also, clearly, it's very frustrating. My son, when he first watched this play as a teenager, he came out, it's like, that was the most frustrating play I ever saw. And it's partly because the way the judges behave, they're so gullible, they believe that spectral evidence, and they are as relentless, in the original Salem trials as they are in the play. Interestingly, it's kind of in that movie screenplay adaptation, the 1996 one. He actually added another judge, Seward, which isn't in the play. And Seward actually he urges a little bit more doubt, at least, to even things out a little bit. But he's overridden by Danforth and Hathorne, the other judge. Hathorne, I love the fact he's in there because he's the great-great-grandfather of the American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne. The family actually dropped they added a W to their name so they wouldn't be associated with Judge Hathorne from the Salem witch trials because he was such an evil dude. He was the only one of all of the judges who never recanted and said, "Oh, I made a mistake." Everybody else, even Danforth, eventually said, "Maybe I made a few mistakes here." So it's kind of interesting. And just the production history of the play, I think, is interesting, as well as the actual occasion of its creation. I mean, Miller had 2 great successes with All My Sons and Death of a Salesman, both directed by his buddy, Eli Kazan. But Kazan in 52 named names to HUAC, and he and Miller fell out. So he couldn't get him to direct. He needed a director. And he was spinning around. Apparently, Jed Harris courted him. He wanted to sort of revive his career. He'd been big in the 30s, but he hadn't had much since. Miller had loved his work on an Ibsen production, a production of Ibsen's Dollhouse, which Miller was a big fan of. He also had seen Our Town. So he was kind of flattered to be courted by Jed Harris. So he gave him the job. And then Harris did not direct the play in the way Miller wanted. He argued all the time with Arthur Kennedy, who was playing John Proctor. He was rude to him all during rehearsals. And in the end, Miller really hated that premiere production that came out in 1953. He felt it was static. He felt it like, he described it as if Jed Harris was trying to create old masters. And Harris sort of, after he saw the previews, the previews not really attracting the crowd, he basically ran off, and Miller actually took over the direction and actually made some changes. He wrote that scene that is still, it's interesting because on published versions of the play, it's always put as an appendix. It's never actually part of the play, but it's supposed to go at the end of Act 2 where Proctor and Abigail meet in the woods. And it's an interesting little scene. And I've seen a lot of productions of the play. Some directors keep it, some directors cut it out. I'd love to find out if Whitney's going to keep it or cut it. But he added that scene. He thought it might make it a little more interesting. He also changed a lot of the scenery to try and make it a little less static. It still wasn't a great success, though. It didn't run from, I think it had 197 performances, which for Miller wasn't so great. And the play kind of flopped. Even Brooks Atkinson, who usually liked Miller plays, didn't really like it. And it kind of sort of disappeared for a while. And then it came back. And it might be because it just needed that bit of distancing from the HUAC trials, where reviewers could feel a little bit more safe praising it and not be sort of have Congress, HUAC breathing down their necks. But it wasn't until 58, an off-Broadway production Word Baker put together, where it was just more visceral. He even did this really weird thing, which I've never seen a production that does it, where he actually added a character called the Book, who actually read all of the historical background details that Miller put in the printed script. And that production was the one that really sort of hit and started people thinking. And by the 60s, it was starting to become this great big play. And now it is definitely Miller's most produced play, and it's produced around the world. And by Royal Shakespeare Company, I think, have done 2 productions of it so far.
Yeah, wow, that is so fascinating, Sue. I could listen to you talk, I think, about Miller for hours and hours and hours. And as you say, in many ways, the most 1950s element of the play is the love triangle and the kind of the very gendered cheating on the wife plot that Miller adds into the play. I read that element of the play and I think, wow, this is Miller working out his marital issues, not at all talking about McCarthy. Jason, you became animated when Sue mentioned the point about Abigail's age being moved up. Obviously, yeah. You worked with Evo on the Crucible. Yeah. You've acted in many Shakespeare plays too. I'm wondering how you respond to this topic in this conversation.
Well, we could have a whole separate conversation about, I'm fascinated by the use of the word Shakespearean, which I know is going to be, we don't have time to talk about that, but the usage of the word Shakespearean is a catch-all, which as an actor, it drives me nuts. And just because, what does that mean? So the things that I would say about the play is obviously there is injustice, there is fantastic language, there is incredible thought, there is good rhetoric, there is fantastic, there's a good strong challenge and conflict. So, and there's large feelings and emotions and things that have to happen. I can't tell you, there's a funny thing that happens often where people say it's Shakespearean, or in the same way they'll say it's Chekhovian. And as an actor, I want to say, no, it's not. But in this instance, the thing that I was really appreciative, Sue, for the things that you said, because I was suddenly remembering these things. Sometimes you do a play and then you put it to bed, you literally are done. And then you're like, oh, what was that choice? And I was looking at the script and trying to remember certain things that we did. I've worked with Evo before. The thing that I appreciate about this play as the most produced play, for a number of reasons, including that high schools across America have a lot of young girls that need to act on the stage. And so they do that production a lot. And that does become, the truth is I'm clearly making a joke, but the truth is that the frequency of how we experience the plays, and especially the first time that we experience them, does become some of the history that we move forward and that we have to navigate as we do them. I can tell you that there was a time when I did the Glass Menagerie at the Kennedy Center, and I love Williams very much. But at the time, before I did it, I thought, boy, this play is covered in dust and I don't want to do it. And it was one of my favorite experiences doing it. Similar with Crucible, I thought, oh boy, what are we doing? The last one I had seen was a very beautiful production. And it was at the then Virginia Theater on Broadway, but now the August Wilson Theater. And the thing that and Laura Linney was amazing, and everybody was amazing. But the thing that I most remember was that Black Sabbath was playing next door at the now gone, what was it called? What was that performance venue called? Roseland. And so in the middle of the trial, you heard through the wall, dum, 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 dum. And I thought it was amazing. Cut to getting to do a production where we had a version of that going on. The thing that I loved about our production was that Evo allows you, I played Sam Paris. He's, the first white guy you meet in a, we'll say, traditional production. And Miller writes a lot of things into his plays, directions, scene directions, and bordering on, one could even say, surrealist things. Death of a Salesman has a lot more innovation and imagery that rarely gets done in productions, which I think is revolutionary considering the idea that we have of it from the first production. In this play, there's tons written about the character and this and that before you even see him. The great thing about our production that I appreciated was that Evo turned up the injustice, and I was able to lean into things. Sam Paris, unquestionably a flawed, weak person, but also there's logic to him. He does say to them when they're going after him, I'm your third, proctor, reverend, I'm your third priest in 7 years. Like, he's dealing with a whole bunch of ornery jerks that he's having to navigate, and social dynamics and accusations and things like that. For me, the thing that always, might be slightly sacrilegious or whatever, I am still waiting, and I loved Yael's production in terms of the handling of Abigail, but I gotta say, for me, one of the challenges of the play is what to do with Abigail. How does that character actually succeed? And that you have to bring into the modern context of certainly misogyny and oppression of women and a young voice. And you also have to reconcile her unbridled desire to break free in some way and honor it. But I frequently frustrate when I think, boy, it's that Abigail is a much harder challenge, and Mary Warren can win a lot more. So I can't wait to see Whitney's production, because I know that she has some strong thoughts that are going to bring us all awake.
The gender politics, as you say, Jason, very, very tricky to navigate, because Abigail, she's so defined by her lust for John Proctor, and she's so much younger than he is. It seems so inappropriate when you read the play. Now, I also love, by the way, this idea of Black Sabbath score for the Crucible, where you just hear like Satan rattling through the floorboards.
Whitney, if you want it. No, she has her whole own soundscape. She doesn't need anything from me.
Well, Whitney, to bring you in, I see you nodding a lot at this conversation, scribbling down some notes, maybe some ideas to chase down. What compels you about this play now in 2021? What drew you to this play, and what do you think is new in the play that is left waiting to be explored?
I mean, I think first I have to say that if you pick up, for all the listeners out there, if you were to pick up this piece, and it is interesting that it's a piece that many Americans encounter in high school. It's one of the earliest, that and Macbeth are very often, when I'm working with students, when I'm working with adults, artists, MFA people all over the country, those are two of the first pieces of theater that you digest as an American. And I think it's really fascinating because you have this legacy of witches, you have this legacy of language. You asked earlier what makes it Shakespearean, and I agree with Jason. The term Shakespearean can be a very frustrating and marginalizing term. However, there is a very strong line from Arthur Miller to Shakespeare, and I see it in the kind of methodical way that Miller is working with language. He demands patience of the audience. He demands that the actors stand up and work through a rhetoric by the skin of their teeth. And it's some of the most muscular, demanding, and kind of honest dialogue in this text. And that's the link for Shakespeare with Shakespeare for me. He's not going to let you get away with a one-liner. He's going to make that character get on stage and bleed for the sake of the argument. And that is what we all inherit from Shakespeare. So there's that. And you asked me why I'm drawn to the play. If you read this piece and then you close your eyes at the end of it, I find that what I'm left with, and maybe what the audience or reader will be left with, is a portrait of a community of people who are paranoid, isolated, afraid, unable to find reliable information that could easily save their lives and their community, not existing in an interconnected world as ours is, unable to find help from any kind of outside source except from a kind of religious or judicial source in a weird kind of way. And when you think about this paranoia and isolation and this kind of settler syndrome that's in the piece, it's quite unsettling and quite disturbing and quite apropos of today. Even though we live in this interconnected world, this global society, how isolated do we all feel? And what happens when all the information that you get from both your interior relationships with your own wife to the exterior, to the state, to your president, when all the information coming at you feels false, feels impossible? What happens to the human psyche in that situation when there's nowhere they can trust? And I think that when you really kind of emotionally put yourself in that place, it might feel very similar to the way you felt the past 12 months of this quarantine. So that's one thing that draws me to the piece. And then the other thing that I feel is very new for me, and kind of jumping off of what Jason said, and the problem of Abigail is like, you know, I'm an African-American woman. I've been to a lot of political actions and protests and gatherings throughout this time that have given me a lot of fortitude, hope, and a space of power and freedom. And something you'll hear sometimes when people are upset, when the judicial things come out and they don't go the way we want, you'll hear this phrase, burn it down. And I think if you look at Abigail and Tituba, in this way, with this phrase in mind, burn it down, they actually become radical survivors. This young woman is a servant in someone's home. She has no standing in society. The world tells her she's already forgotten because she's not married. She doesn't come from a family of note. There's no way for this white female to have any type of upward mobility in her life. And then she falls in love with a man who also takes advantage of her. And then he has the nerve to deny her the one thing she has in her life. And she's like, are you serious? And then she burns it all down. And I think Tituba in this moment, when she turns to the audience, is like, are you kidding? There's no magic in this world. We danced in the woods. And then she's like, fine, they were with the devil. I think Abigail and Tituba, in these very radical ways, look out at a system that is not going to offer them anything. And they're like, you know what? I'm going to push exit in my own crazy way by any means necessary. And I think it's not the best way to go about finding your feminine power, but you know what? They survived that play. And I think that is something that has power in it. So that's what's drawing me to it right now. Oh, one more thing. If you haven't out there, listeners, watched, Adam Curtis is a documentary filmmaker who works with the BBC. Maybe Simon has seen this. And he's put out this series called Can't Get You Out of My Head. And it is the most magnificent thing I've ever seen. I think it's one of the most magnificent examples of filmmaking we have in the Western world. And in the first episode, it's a 6-part series that's completely free on the BBC. He talks about this thing I mentioned called settler syndrome, the possibility that many Americans today still have these deep-seated paranoias, still have these deep-seated kind of spaces of fear of the other, fear of the outside world because of our origins. You look at Jamestown, how it failed. You look at these different settlements and you look at the cost of pioneership. And it's a very interesting thing and pairs quite nicely with the play, I have to say. So I recommend it.
Yeah, so in other words, Whitney, the power of the marginalized figure, Abigail and Tituba, they are marginalized, they are the other in this play. And yes, it's problematic the way Miller dramatizes, specifically Abigail, and the way she's sexualized.
No, Drew, I kind of disagree with you. I don't know what's problematic about it. Maybe it's for another talk. We will have many talks. Drew and I will be working on this play together. In fact, why I love working with Drew so much is we're always seeing these two sides of the coin, and we usually land on a kind of dramaturgical truth that is multifaceted. But we might have to have a side zoom because I don't know. I think Proctor is the problematic one who's a little off the ranch, as you say. But let's talk about it more anon.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm totally willing to let go of this idea of Abigail being a problem in the play. I agree. John Proctor, he admits his own failings, right? It's a huge part of the arc of his character. Another point that you made that I love is the isolation of these people. I think it's very cunning the way Miller writes into the play. Reverend Paris, as you mentioned, Jason, he's a Harvard educated priest, and he's the 7th in 3 years or whatever. Like the way that these well-educated elites are fostering a kind of paranoia, a kind of fear of knowledge, a kind of ignorance, and a burn it down mentality in the populace is a terrifying and I think very contemporary aspect of the play. Simon, you're deeply lost in thought. I'm wondering how all this is chiming in your ears.
Well, I think what's fantastic is, first of all, a great shout out from Whitney to Adam Curtis. He is a remarkable filmmaker. I totally agree. He made a very important series in England called The Power of Nightmares that was on previously to the series that Whitney talks about, which made a huge impression on many of us in Great Britain. So I think absolutely a brilliant steer. And I think what I'm reminded of is when I hear the panelists talk and Whitney speak as a director, I'm really aware of how much we've talked on this program about how in the hands of artists, these plays can burn into new life. And I think of talking of The Taming of the Shrew with Liliana Blaine Cruz a few weeks ago, and how extraordinary solution to the poisoning of everyone at the end, and this sense that these plays are just not what they seem. And I guess I'm also thinking of Peter Brook's lovely phrase about, if you let a play speak for itself, sometimes it will be silent. And you have to conjure the voice out of a play afresh if you are a great director. And I think we've had a great kind of insight to that this evening. Before I hand over, well, actually, maybe we should go straight, in fact, before I do a little more of an interval broadcast, let's go straight over to Grace Ann. Grace Ann, any thoughts from our listeners, our viewers tonight about anything that's been shared, their feelings about the play or its origins, what it can mean now? Grace Ann.
Yes. So I'd love to start with a question that's maybe more dramaturgical in its origins. So viewer Terry asks, if King James I's treatise on witchcraft was used as a reference during the Salem trial. So I don't know if anyone knows the yes or no answer to that. And then second, I wanted to share a comment from viewer Anne to support your point, Whitney, the link between Miller and Shakespeare, that he will make the character, you have to bleed to make your point. But Anne says, what I love in Miller is what I love in Shakespeare. I keep trying to decide who is right and what the real motivations of the characters are. And I think that totally supports what you were saying, even on an audience level, that even in the audience, we are tracking, like trying to parse the argument. And that's where we see those connections, why Miller remains so relevant. Sue mentioned the Royal Shakespeare Company producing Miller and the Crucible, why Miller finds a home in these classical companies. So I wanted to lift up Anne's words there too, but maybe King James I, if anyone could speak to that.
I don't have much. It's funny. I love that question. I think the kind of abstract answer is yes, that's in the kind of lineage of those settlers, you know, but it's really interesting, the research I've been doing, and Sue's going to have so many more smart things to say as to where their understanding of witchcraft, the line of it, the proof of it, how you find it. It's a really kind of fascinating kind of line all the way back to the Inquisition that you can draw. And I love this question, and now I'm going to try and bring it into rehearsal. But really quickly, I think the second thing that Anne said about rhetoric and the audience having to make up their minds for themselves, this is why we need the theater. You can't click a link and someone tell you what to think. Someone can't tell you this is right or this is wrong. You can't look at a headline and have someone tell you how to think. You have to come to the theater, listen to the arguments, and think for yourself. And so, I mean, that is you and the listener, you're amazing, because that is why we need to do this is why we need to go to the theater as human beings, so that we can stay in touch with our ability to make decisions for ourselves. It's greatly put.
Well, here, Whitney. Look, everyone, I'm just going to just take a little interval moment, and then I'm going to go back, if I may, starting with Sue, and then Jason, and then Whitney, to talk a little bit more about the detail of this extraordinary text that we're talking about, and hearing some of Miller's language. The rest will get to work. And before we do that, just to let you know that this is the last Shakespeare Hour live for a little while. We're having a break, but we'll be back on May the 5th with a very special guest, Rufus Wainwright is going to be joining us to talk about Shakespeare's sonnets. He's recorded an album based on the sonnets, so we'll be talking to Rufus about his experience of musicalizing Shakespeare's greatest love poetry. And we're also going to be featuring other exciting guests, such as the ACA, our very own ACA director, Alec Wilde, in subsequent weeks, talking about training for Shakespeare, and Professor Daniel Pollock-Pelsner, whose name you might recognize from his bylines in The New Yorker and The Atlantic, and many other guests. And he'll be talking about Shakespeare's final act, the romances. If you haven't registered, please do so, and we hope that you'll come back and visit us in the spring. Thank you. That was the intermission broadcast done. Let me now pivot to, thank you, to Sue on some, Sue, your responses to some things that have been said, and perhaps a little glimpse of Miller in action. Sue.
Well, there's some great stuff. The whole thing about Abigail being an issue is so fascinating. I would point out there have been so many spin-off plays about Abigail that people have written, and there's one, The Burn, I think it's called, which is some of them were they just reenact Crucible in a modern situation and sort of take on the roles of the characters. But there's also the Abigail, I forget the date on it, Abigail. It's sometime after, and it tries to follow what happens to Abigail after. And also Tituba, another character who has the Marissa Conde book. It's like these characters clearly have caught people's attention, and it is recognized that they are treated abominably. I mean, they are conjuring in the woods, they are doing spells, because that's the only way they can feel any control over their lives in this sort of puritanical white male society where, they have no say. I mean, Abigail, poor Abigail, really, I always feel sorry for her, the way she's treated by Proctor. I thought it was interesting in the film version with Abigail, where Miller wrote an additional scene where he actually has Abigail go to Proctor in jail and offer to take off his chains so he can run away with her. It's like, she really is in love with this guy. And again, you can see Daniel Day-Lewis, he's tempted, but he's not going to go for it because he's got to do what a man's got to do, kind of thing. The whole witch thing, I think, is kind of interesting. And another thing, I know I always keep track of the productions of the play, and there was a huge uptake of productions of the Crucible around October. Every year, a lot of people want this going on during Halloween season. I'm also a huge fan of Shakespeare. I've actually seen 36 of the plays in a live production. So if you hear of Timon and Athens being on, I've missed a couple of times that's been put on.
Well, there we are, Sue. I'm sorry, we were in fact doing it when the Timon of Athens, when the lockdown came. So yet again, I'm so sorry that you've missed the chance to tick Timon. But Sue, do you have a little bit of the Crucible text that you'd like to share with us, that you feel?
Oh, sure. I actually just have one of my favorite lines from the play is in the fourth act, where Proctor declares to Danforth, where Danforth's trying to get him to confess, and he says, and it's just a great line, where he says, I speak my own sins. I cannot judge another. I have no tongue for it. I mean, it has a great resonance, I mean, on both political and personal levels, and it makes, clearly, I mean, Proctor is Miller's mouthpiece in this play. It seems to me it's almost Shakespearean in its apparent simplicity and yet the potential layers of meaning in it. It's eminently quotable too, you know, like so many of Miller's wonderful phrases to which attention must be paid, little Death of a Salesman joke thrown in there. But politically this is Proctor kind of refusing to report on his neighbors, which is, of course, the same sentiment that Miller used 3 years later when he gives testimony in front of Congress. His testimony, he actually says, I could not use the name of another person and bring trouble on him. It's like he pre-wrote his lines that he was going to say in front of HUAC. But on the personal side, this line is also, it's a confession on Proctor's part, not just to witchcraft, but to, I mean, rather not even to witchcraft, but to his adultery. That's the thing he's really confessing about. And that's the true crime of which both Proctor and Miller were guilty. And again, when Miller testified in front of HUAC, having now ditched his wife and married Monroe, he tells the committee, I take the responsibility for everything I have ever done, but I cannot take responsibility for another human being. And he obviously holds true to that as a few years later. He walks away from Monroe too, as her needs became overwhelmingly demanding, which is something he'll tell us about in one of his later plays, After the Fall. The point though for me here is what makes, it goes to the heart of what makes Proctor as a character so engaging. It's not his heroism, but his flawed humanity. He is a deeply flawed human being. And like all of Miller's other heroes, his death is less a noble sacrifice than kind of an apology for sins past. He's taking responsibility for the stuff he's done, basically. And I think, you know, like so many of Shakespeare's heroes, his death writes something in the world and makes it potentially better. Miller always said, you know, tragedy is the most optimistic of the theatrical genres.
Wow, Sue, thank you. That's a fascinating discussion in its own right about, yes, what does tragedy give us? How does it make us feel? Does it break or does it heal? Jason, I wonder whether, yes, you want to respond to some of those things. You set that wonderful provocation about Abigail. Who is Abigail?
You know, I could say the same thing about Ophelia, truly, because I'm like, I always think some of the issue is wanting more stage time and the challenges for what those actresses get to do and what they have to do. And frankly, you know, somebody wants to play them and you think, I want to understand why you want to play them and what you're going to do. And also, in no way do I ever want to, it's funny, sorry, Sue, the thing I was remembering, you know, of the time, the common acceptance that these young girls, the men would have sex with them. Like that was just, it was very commonplace. Like obviously we're talking about pedophilia is what we're talking about, but so I wouldn't want to shy away from that, nor in any way would I ever want to shy away from Abigail's fury and power and journey. I just find myself, that extra scene written for the movie or the extra scene don't do a whole lot for me. I would much rather, if you're going to have the stage time, I would much rather keep Tituba and Sarah in the beginning of Act 4. You know, which ended up getting cut from our production. But some of that just has to do with, on Broadway, everybody, if you go over 11 p.m., it costs a lot more money. So they have to, you got to get it in 3 hours. So choose your cuts wisely. The thing, you know, one of the things I really appreciate about Miller, and especially I got to see it in his daughter's doc, Arthur Miller, a writer that she did. I really appreciated seeing him, obviously he's talking to his daughter, but seeing him at an elder point in his life be really honest and frank about how he lived his life and the choices that he made and how he came from, where he came from, and money and America and Maryland and Inga. Like I really appreciated, and we did this play, you know, when, I forget when we did the play, but it was so relevant at that time in terms of somebody, an elder man, being able to actually speak coherently and own his life, including the flaws of his life, which I will obviously put to Proctor as well. everybody in that play. There is a cliche that can happen with every single one of the characters in terms of, and this happens in a Shakespeare production as well too, with the best of intentions to show the polarity, the complexity, the journeys that people go through. Sometimes, because they are such big plays, sometimes we dive deep, and in the interest of time that we get to rehearse it, we miss the boat because we embrace the cliche. That happens in this play. This happens with productions of this play without question. One of the things I loved in Yale's production was the fury of it was so vibrant and got me really excited.
Jason, I think you might have a Shakespeare passage up your sleeve.
I have I've been doing this Shakespeare thing for fun every Thursday, just a group of actors, some of them actually great actors with you. And we've been looking at Lear, and Sue told me tonight that I didn't realize that Miller kept a copy of Lear on the side of his bed. So I was thinking about Edmund's speech and the ideas, the preconceived notions we have about Edmund the bastard and his duplicity and his scheming. And the fact of the matter is, at the time when they did the play, and the time now, there's a whole lot of children formed out of wedlock out in the world, given a bad rap for nothing that they had to do with anything. So here's a small snippet of, and he embarks on nature. He goes to nature. The beginning of it is, of course, he's by himself. We've just seen all hell break loose from the first scene, and Lear sending Cordelia off and everything. And then we find him by himself. And then he's saying to hopefully somebody, "Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law, my services are bound." Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me, for that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother? Why bastard? Wherefore base? When my dimensions are as well compact, my mind is generous, and my shape as true as honest madam's issue. Why brand they us with base, with baseness, bastardy, base, base? Who in the lusty stealth of nature take more composition and fierce quality than doth within a dull, stale, tired bed go to the creating a whole tribe of fops got tween asleep and awake? Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. Our father's love is to the bastard Edmund as to the legitimate, fine word, legitimate. Well, my legitimate. If this letter speed and my intention thrive, Edmund the base shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper. Now, gods, stand up for bastards. And I like thinking about this, that in looking at down in the globe, the people who are sat, the people who are sat who could afford the seats, a lot of those people had a lot of illegitimate children running around old London town. So I appreciate the use of God. His life is ruled by nature, a goddess, and yes, this selection at the end to say, okay, I'm gonna maleify it now. I'm gonna say either you or all of you or whatever. The play between the audience knowing who is there is something Miller does exceptionally well also, I think.
Absolutely, Jason. By the way, you read it brilliantly. Thank you. It was just fabulous to be transported so brilliantly. And in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Whitney to respond to that and to hear some of her text. But I feel, Jason, what you reminded me of this evening is how Shakespeare, the soliloquy, is so akin to a prayer. And the religiosity of Shakespeare's sacred language, even be it from very unpredictable characters that are doing very profane actions, but they're doing it in a sort of vein of sorcery, prayer, the sacred, and how that connects to witchery and to the other in a very live and fertile way, I think. Grace, and before we hear from Whitney, is there anything you'd like to share with our audience that Whitney might also speak to in her kind of, I guess almost, in her remarks?
I have an anecdote from viewer Catherine Elwell, who is one of our supporters tonight, but I would love to save it for the end, and I would love to hear Whitney's text first, maybe, and we could come back to the comment later.
First of all, I just have to say, it's like Jason, that I teared up a little bit there. I can't believe how much I miss being in the presence of actors channeling language. I really did sit back and just kind of like let myself experience that. So thank you. You're such a fantastic actor. All right, I have a little bit of Proctor. It's in Act 3, and it does this sacred thing that Simon talked about is exactly why I love the Miller, because it's the sacred and how it's channeled through the body. It's actually a physiological thing that is studied scientifically. When you stand up in front of a bunch of people, your reptilian brain and all of your senses naturally tell you to get out, to run. That's just a human thing. It's an animalistic thing. And what the actor, what someone who's incredible like Jason has to do is channel the will to stay there. And once you start going through all this language of a 50-line soliloquy or a Miller-like monologue, what happens is your body starts to vibrate. And as you're vibrating, very special things start to happen. So this is kind of one of the times in the play I've seen actors attack this and transcendence starts to happen, right? It's in Act 3, and Proctor says, you know, they're like, are you a lecher? They just, Danforth, I love how Danforth just kind of like a very Jerry Springer style is like, are you a lecher? You know, he throws it out. And Proctor, in the midst of his response, says the following. I'll just give a little bit of it quickly. She, being Abigail, she used to serve me in my house, sir. A man may think God sleeps, but God sees everything. I know it now. I beg you, sir, I beg you, see her what she is. My wife, my dear good wife, took this girl soon after, sir, and put her out on the high road. And being what she is, a lump of vanity, sir, excellency, forgive me, forgive me. She thinks to dance with me on my wife's grave. And well she might, for I thought of her softly. God help me. I love that. I love that little passage. It just is like a direct link to me. It goes on, and it just takes me completely to Othello's Think of Me for What I Am and his final act before he commits suicide. It's just like, you know, Miller gives good court scenes, so does Shakespeare, where you see these male characters, heterosexual male characters, just have to open up every kind of crevice and hidden corner of their interior.
And you expose great vulnerability in the language, and that's also so extraordinary that it's the kind of, as Sue was talking about, the sort of deft use of language, which is poetic, but in a very understated way. It's a kind of it's an opening of the heart as well as the mind. It's very clever, I think. Drew, how before we get back over to Grace Ann for the closing anecdote, as it were, Drew, how are you feeling? What connections are you drawing between these passages?
Well, I think it's come up a few times, but this notion that what is truly Shakespearean, if we can use that adjective without being, you know, chased by the people who use Orwellian and Kafkaesque, and you know, he's joined that list of do not mentionables. But the architectonic quality of the writing in this play, and almost the durational. Whitney, you were talking about this is why we do theater, right? Because you have to sit in a place and experience something communally over time. And by the time you get to the final moments of this play, it is just completely devastating. And you look at the language that Miller is using. Yes, it's very impressive in one way, but it's also quite simple, simply constructed. It's just King Jamesian rhetoric, simple English language. But there's something about the vibrations that happen by the end of this play that is really quite unique. And I think it, you know, Miller scholars will argue about whether Death of a Salesman is his crowning masterpiece, or The Crucible, or maybe, I don't know, All My Sons Are Viewed from the Bridge. I'm sure there are some partisans in those camps, but I think it deserves its placement as the most produced Miller play, not just because it's PG-13 in its language and it has a lot of roles for women, but it is a kind of classically structured tragedy and history play, all in one, that's saying some very provocative things about American society that still resonate. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking about, the admiration for the construction of the dramaturgy.
Well, I think we have found some really meaningful links between the two dramatists tonight, and which has really helped me understand Shakespeare, and indeed The Crucible in a new light. Grace Ann.
Yeah, just before we hear final thoughts from everyone, I wanted to share this story from Catherine Elwell, who, like I said, is one of our supporters tonight, connecting us to the Salem witch trials themselves. So she says, Sarah Jessica Parker discovered that a very distant great-grandmother, Esther Elwell, was the last woman to be accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. Esther's life was spared. Miss Parker and I spoke about this in 2014 and about Elwell heritage, very much linked to this story. So I just thought I was really moved by that, and I wanted to share that Miss Elwell has a very deep connection to this story potentially. And before we left, I wanted to make sure I mentioned it. Drew.
Well, thank you, Grace. And yes, Drew.
There's one other thing that we didn't really mention that I think is an interesting connection to Shakespeare, which is the Puritanism, right? Obviously, Shakespeare famously writes about Malvolio, right, who is his kind of stage Puritan. And then you get the Cromwell Revolution in the 1640s and 50s, where they literally cut off Charles I's head and install a religious fundamentalist theocracy in England for 20-something years and ban the theater. And that is very much the same social and political context that the New England settlers are embodying in this place. It's different than colonial Jamestown. New England is settled by the descendants of Malvolio, saying there shall be no more cakes and ale. So, King James is one of the things that resonates, and the fascination with witches and witchcraft, but also Shakespeare being really onto something about the power of this kind of social conservatism and religious fundamentalism to really profoundly shape society.
No, well, I think we're all nodding our heads, Drew. I think that's a brilliant connection. Look, we've got time to hear from our great panelists one more time before we say goodnight. Sue, let's start with you, if I may. Some closing sentences, and then Jason, and then Whitney. Great, Sue.
All right, I just have to mention, I remember reading an article that said actually Marilyn Monroe was able to trace her lineage to one of the accused witches as well. But I'd just like to say, Miller's first ever play that he wrote as a student was called No Villain. And I think that's because he got from Ibsen the idea that people are complex and no one's an out-and-out villain. I love Edmund the Bastard is the greatest in King Lear, in my eyes at least. I'm rooting for him all the way. I'm also rooting for Goneril. Primogenitor, she should have gotten the whole shebang, but she gets shafted, unfortunately, because he prefers the younger daughter. But back to Miller, thing he's interested in is matters of conscience. The individual person's battle between selfishness and doing the morally right thing. Human beings are, by their very nature, capable of evil, and often we choose to do bad rather than good. But when we choose to do good, in Miller's eyes, that's the heroism in some ways. Pretty much everyone in the Crucible does something bad or wrong, and some admit it, and some just double down, like the Putnams, right?
Yeah, so true. And conscience is another very interesting link between Shakespeare and Miller in that respect. It's such a vibrant, resonant word, isn't it? When he talks about the body reacting to language, conscience, even to say it is to touch something in us all. Jason.
I would just say, the theater, boy, I can get really emotional about it really quickly because I miss it and I miss the power of it. And obviously one of the main functions of the theater is to entertain, but the communal experience that is the theater that we often sort of overlook, which is literally being in a group of, especially now, the way we interact with technology and can literally live for a year by ourselves in our guest bedrooms with our devices. But what happens when you are in a group of people, heart beats aligning, they've shown studies, and things also similar, that when you're an actor on stage on an opening night, the adrenaline amounting, surging through an actor's body it supersedes a Super Bowl football player's thing. Anyway, my point is the theater is a way to gather and share ideas and, as you say, conscience, which both of these writers worked hard. There is a didacticism in them, and there is also a sense of living through an experience together and hopefully getting on the other side of that evening, even if in a traditional year when you have subscriptions everywhere and you think, oh, I have to go see Romeo and Juliet again. But you usually get to the other side of it having had some revelation, some sense of tolerance and patience with your fellow humankind, that actually we couldn't need more right now, and hopefully registering some thought about your own actions in your own life. In the way that a lot of people who do go to church, there's a sense, these little, we're just little slow thinkers that need little moments to remind ourselves on how to be better people, better husbands, better wives, better everything. So that's all.
Wow, Jason, thank you. It's an emotional experience that we're having right now, and I'm so grateful for that as a glimpse of something that we're going to be having together when we can. Whitney.
That was beautiful. I think I only have one thing to say. I think it's interesting in this talk, we focus on what I call the stars, the celebrities of the play, the Proctors and the Abigails and the Tituba's. But when you come see my production, our production, I urge you to look at the quietest person on stage, because it takes the whole community to yield that tragic output. It's not just Abigail. And those people that are watchful and don't speak up for very valid reasons, that's us. And so it's like Hero for me, and Much Ado has always been my favorite character. The people are us, and it takes a village to yield the output. So I think it's like, pay attention to those people that go along with or don't go along with what happens in the play. What can we learn from it?
Goodness, thank you, Whitney. I've taken too little care of this, I think, as King Lear says, and we realize at our peril how little we notice and how much we gain by paying attention. Thank you. Well, it's an emotional farewell from us to you all, because we're going to have a break for a few weeks. We are back, as I mentioned earlier, with Rufus Wainwright coming to talk to us all about the sonnets. And if you're not feeling too fatigued by Romeo and Juliet, Jason and I recognize very much the Verona over-familiarity, then do, while we're away, check out April 23rd, PBS, when yours truly, my production of Romeo and Juliet, will be, the film of it from the National Theatre will be shown. And I think that's really it, apart from saying a huge thank you to the whole SCC team, to Grace Ann, to Drew, and of course to our fabulous guests, Sue, Jason, and Whitney. Thank you for making this such a wonderful, profound evening. And be safe, be well, and we'll see you all soon. And it's cheerio from all of us here on the Shakespeare Hour. Good night.